as we said before, we have a packed show today. We have a lot to get to. And why don't we start with some news that we heard this past week, some sad news. And it made a lot of people think of you when they heard the news. The passing of Bob Caudle, legendary commentator for Mid-Atlantic Wrestling. And of course, for the first few years of Smoky Mountain Wrestling, he was the voice. For a long time, him and Dutch Mantell. He was on WCW. Maybe they didn't use him enough. But Bash 89, it's Jim Ross and Bob Caudle. And they work really well together. So, Jim, let's talk a little bit about the life of Bob Caudle.
Well, and first of all, we'll talk about all the Smoky Mountain announcers, how they interacted with Bob here shortly. But you mentioned specifically that Bash, anybody could work with Bob because he was the consummate television broadcast personality. And I've talked about it so many times, the charm of local television and the training ground of local TV in the live days and the early studio days. And it was like the vaudeville for television personalities where they got a chance to do everything. And that's what Bob had. He was 95 years old, bless him. So he was the same generation as Lance Russell, and kind of the same thing where they had the opportunity to do every job there was in broadcasting at some point or another because of their careers. He'd been on radio. He had been the weatherman at WRAL television in Raleigh, where they also did the old studio wrestling show for Crockett before they moved out to the arenas at the start of the 80s. He had gone back to studio wrestling in the late 50s. And that's why it was so easy to work with him, and he was so smooth because he'd had a microphone in his hand talking to people. You know, when he was doing the Smoky Mountain show, that was 30 years ago. He was 65 years old. He'd been doing it for 40 fucking years then. So, and he never got flustered really, or upset or nervous, or, you know, even when shit was going on that he may not necessarily have understood what the fuck is happening, when his shit might have been falling apart on TV, right? He just knew enough when to just lay out or when to go, oh, golly, to his broadcast partner. But you never caught him, you know, at a loss, right? And so anyway, he was just, again, along with Lance Russell, I think of Bob the same way I thought of Lance, not only because they were the same generation, same profession, same professionalism, but because they were both among the nicest guys in the world.
You know, you want to talk about a dream team of announcers. NWA 1989, peak Jim Ross. I know everyone likes the Attitude Era stuff, but to me, this period of time for Jim Ross, he was incredible. Yeah. Lance Russell, Gordon Solie, who may not have been the Gordon Solie of years earlier, but was still good and had that big night in Troy, New York, calling the Terry Funk Ric Flair match.
And had the gravitas.
Yeah. And Bob Caudle. Yeah. I mean, that's a Mount Rushmore of wrestling commentators right there.
And it basically coalesced the announcers from the strong NWA territories that had persevered, you know, until the end. And actually, to be honest, when they had all those announcers on the same programming, even though they all weren't paired on the exact same shows, but under the same umbrella, it did sometimes take away from each one of them because, you know, they had always been, in various points in different parts of the country, the lead announcer that would have a sidekick, and suddenly the all-star team, it almost takes away when there's no sidekick. But nevertheless, and of course, Lance Russell did not have the chance in WCW. He went for the guaranteed money, and he, you know, had friends there, etc. But they just offered him so much money, it was like, oh my God. and he saw that Memphis was on its way down. But when you only got like green screen Lance, and doing the leads for Power Pro or NWA Pro
Yeah.
or whatever syndication, you weren't getting Lance. And a lot of those guys didn't have time to get over his personalities with the viewer because they were just being changed from one syndicated show to the other. But back to Bob.
Who was on plenty of syndicated shows and was so good he made Johnny Weaver bearable.
Poor Johnny Weaver was trying, but sometimes he just couldn't quite get it out. The first time I met Bob Caudle was the first time he interviewed me I guarantee you, I'm 100% sure it was Spartanburg, South Carolina. When we had just gotten there, working for Crockett, and the first time we met face to face was on the set in front of the live crowd that was screaming, the old Spartanburg Crockett syndicated tapings, right? That crowd screaming, and there's a couple of spotlights and the NWA backdrop, and they do the interviews in front of that next to the desk, right? And then through the darkened ringside area, because they wouldn't light the whole building, you walk through that and then you get it to the ring. It's a small place. It's always packed. So I had never, actually, as I said, met him because the building was so small, not only inside, they'd get 1,800 or 2,000 people in there and it would be 150 degrees, but behind the scenes was small too. That's where remember Dusty and Magnum pulled me out of the building and tied me to the back of the truck and Baby Doll almost decapitated me.
Yeah.
That's that building. So there's only 2 little dressing rooms for all the baby faces and all the heels and the fucking referees. So what they would do is they would put Johnny Weaver, David Crockett, Bob Caudle, Tony Schiavone, whoever the announcers were at a specific time in another small little office behind the set so they could just walk right out and back and didn't have to go through the people. And it saved room in the locker room, right? There was no room. So finally my promo came up and I don't even remember what show it was on. Or even, it was the first time I had the opportunity on Crockett's syndicated TV to be mad about something. Maybe Jimmy Valiant had done something. I don't know, but we'd only been there a few weeks. And I fucking charge across there and I'm yelling at the people and Bob's holding the mic and I'm doing a yelling and all of a sudden he said something. And when I looked at him, it was Bob with that basset hound face. He was just such a kindly looking man, right? But at the same time, it's a summertime and it's 150 degrees in that fucking building. And I'm sweating and he's not only sweating, he's red in the face. And we're all about ready to have a stroke. And just the red face and the fucking sweat. I said, shut up and don't interrupt me, you drunken alcoholic or something. And I go back and cut the promo, right? Because I never knew what I was going to say till something's in front of me. But when I get to the back, after the segment or whatever, David Crockett came in and he said, do you realize what you just said? I said, well, what do you mean? I didn't cuss. He said, you called an aide to Senator Jesse Helms a drunken alcoholic. And at that point, I said, who is Jesse Helms? Because I'm 24 years old. I have no goddamn, maybe not even yet. I don't know what the fuck's going on in the world of politics. I'm still trying to learn the wrestling. And for the younger viewers out there, Jesse Helms was the Republican senator from North Carolina who was ancient even then. He's, I'm sure, been dead for 30 years, but he was known for being the most prim and proper and anti-smut and, church going and conservative back when they were still weird conservative, but not insane like today conservative.
Well, he was a bigot too.
Well, yeah, the standard regular old fucking conservatives, rather than the goddamn cultish ones today that'll just go along. But nevertheless, whatever the fuck it was of conservatism back then, he was it. And Bob Caudle, who after his career, because remember then he's in his mid 50s then. After his career at the TV station, he had stayed with Crockett, but also taken a job as his senior aide. So on one of the most popular syndicated television programs in the fucking Carolinas, I've called Jesse Helms' senior aide a drunken alcoholic. I said, should I apologize? They said, oh, Bob's not mad, but somebody might try to kill you. So that's when I first met him.
Senior aide, was he ever making phone call like, is the president there? I have Jesse Helms.
I don't know, because
that voice. I mean, he had that great voice,
Yes. But that's the thing is that he did never. I never sat and talked to him about politics. As I said, I wasn't, involved or interested at that point in time. It is not like, Bob was just the most pleasant fucking guy, but he's there to do the wrestling show. And remember, we told a story not related to, anything about Bob's health. We didn't know this was obviously going to take place a month or two ago when we were just talking about he named the November to Remember, the rating sweep period series of matches that we did in WCW in 89, or the November 89 sweeps month. And he's the one that named it. We had just told that story. But, he was always there with some suggestion or something, or could bail you out of a pickle if you got stuck on a promo or whatever it was just because he was smooth. And especially in Smoky Mountain, there were some times that he was encountered with things he didn't know was going to take place, either on the technical side or just we hadn't thought of it yet, or the backdrop would fall down or whatever. But he'd go with it, right?
There's that footage of one of the early Gangsters promos where New Jack is just saying outrageous things on TV. And it's a close-up of New Jack. But you see Bob Caudle, like, holding the microphone. You just see him shaking his head. I think it's when he thanked OJ. Said, two less than him to worry about. You just see Bob Caudle like, no. Shaking his head. It's amazing you got him to travel that much. I mean, I guess not amazing, but, when he did the tapings for Crockett, it was all in the Carolinas. He wasn't, for the most part. I mean, was he ever going to Tennessee? Was he ever going to Kentucky?
Well, no, not until obviously, Crockett started expanding, but Crockett was still doing TV all over the place. Remember, even before started doing TV all over the place, even before they sold to Turner. But with Bob's travel, then see, that was why I had such a amazing lineup of announcers, but I didn't have the all-star team all at one time, because I was able to, when we first started, Les Thatcher was available and able to do our special live events, like the big events that we would tape in Knoxville or Johnson City, like Fire on the Mountain or the Volunteer Slam or whatever, because Les had a business going in Cincinnati at the time. I believe it was a gym. Nevertheless, he couldn't get away during the week, but he could get away on weekends. And obviously, we had talked to Bob Caudle about doing the show since, the inception of when we publicly revealed the idea, because Sandy Scott had known him forever, and he was a voice of a lot of markets that we wanted to get into. And, Knoxville being our base, we were obviously wanted to have a connection with Les also. But with Bob living in
Well,
Raleigh at the start, go ahead.
Les had been the commentator for Southeastern Wrestling, so he had a long
Yes.
history of doing commentary in Eastern Tennessee for the fans who may not understand the connection between Les Thatcher and Knoxville.
Well, I just automatically thought, my God, it's household knowledge all across the world, even in greater Swaziland and northern Norway. But nevertheless, so Bob was living in Raleigh. But when we first started Smoky Mountain Wrestling, you know who else was living in Raleigh?
Who?
Ron Wright.
Really?
Ron Wright had moved when there was the business had closed down in East Tennessee. I think he had again something to do with mechanic. He had a mechanics go-kart repair, whatever, because he raced shit and did stuff all his life. So he had some type of business, I believe, in Raleigh. Bo James is probably going to be screaming at his speakers, "You got it all wrong." But nevertheless, Ron Wright was living in Raleigh. And we needed him when we first made the deal. Ron and Bob were riding over to the tapings together, and it was once every 3 weeks. And so, again, bless him, Bob was 65 at that point 30 years ago, or almost 65, 33 years ago, whenever we started, whatever. But they could ride together, and it made the trip easier. And I just used Bob for the actual TV tapings. He never did any of the live events because that would have been another trip over, and he was doing us a favor anyway. And bless his heart, he got $450 for every TV taping. And I can't even remember how we arrived at that figure. And that is more like fucking, $1,200 or whatever in today's money, but still maybe $1,000. I don't know.
That was one of the great things about Smoky Mountain, though. The team of Bob Caudle and Dutch Mantell, one of the more underrated commentating teams in wrestling history, just because you don't hear more people talking about them. But for the run of them being there, they worked so well together. And it was such a good dynamic that worked for a heel and the straightest of straight men. And it worked. And, I always hate the Puerto Rican promotion for stealing Dutch Mantell of commentary because it was such a great team. And, that was one of the highlights of the early years of Smoky Mountain was that team.
Well, and see, again, now Dutch was living in Nashville at the time. And so it was just 3 hours over for him for Knoxville, or, a few hours more for the TVs we did in Virginia. But nevertheless, Dutch was wrestling some too as part of the stud stable with Robert Fuller and Jimmy Golden. But he was the regular color guy with Dutch with Bob. And like you said, he was an entertaining heel whose job was not to make people hate him. The other two in the ring could take care of that. And at the same time, you always knew that he'd look out for his buddy Bob if anything broke down, right? And Bob Caudle, as Jim Ross called him one time, the epitome of a white man, who is just brown shoes and just a jolly attitude. And they worked so well together, and Dutch's signs would make fun of Bob in a kidding way. But again, so Bob and Dutch would do the actual weekly television taping. But when we do a big, a big event taping, we'd have Les come and do it with Dutch a lot. And sometimes Dutch do some of the regular monthly arena shows if we needed somebody for an angle by himself. And then, as you said, Dutch got the job to book in Puerto Rico and had to leave. But by that point, we were able to get, more dates on Les. And then, Bob was a constant for the first 130 or 35, 40 shows. Yeah. Out of 200, the first 2+ years. But then and I can't forget Lance. I never got Lance and Bob together, but I had Lance and Les because Lance came over and did the Bluegrass Brawl for me that one year and
93.
did another.
Yeah.
And the same year in Knoxville did the volunteer slam because he just wanted to take a trip to the mountains with Audrey. And he said, "Oh, I love to, pal, come over and it was just great to have those voices on those events. But then JR had gotten shystered by Vince one of the many numerous times. I can't remember what happened, not germane to the story. And JR and Dennis Brent I had talked to them about not only JR doing the TV, but they were starting to run the Smoky Mountain Wrestling 900 number when that was a thing. And blah, blah, blah. And we were wanting to get JR's voice on as much as we could to try to get an international deal that Howard Brody was working on at the time. So Ron had moved back to East Tennessee and Bob was starting to get older. And I gave Bob I said, "Bob, we have JR coming in and he's going to be, doing more with us in various aspects of the business. I know it's getting harder on you." And that way he could bow out gracefully and say, "I'm not going to drive over those fucking mountains." He would never say fuck, but "I'm not going to drive over those mountains anymore for $450 or whatever." So that's the only reason that he stopped doing the show, was because we took pity on him and he didn't want to let us down.
And at the very end was kind of the only time he may have ever showed his age, because that's when at the very, very end, he started, like, Steve Skyfire became Steve Skydiver.
Yeah.
And, he got Storm and Jericho mixed up, but, they were also brand new and he had never been.
Well, but that's the thing, is that at that point, and we didn't air in Raleigh. So he could watch the fucking TV. I mean, if he'd asked, he might have sometime. We gave him the VHSs, but it's not like Bob at this time of his life was studying the wrestling, right? And so we would show him these people that nobody's ever fucking heard of before. Here, this guy's name is Wang Doodle Peterson. And so, yeah, but it was more of a we're having pity on you, Bob. You can retire now because, we've got other people to take over. Thank you. But we don't want to kill your ass.
He was so good and it came across genuine, everything he said. Again, he kind of had like a folksy kind of thing. It just felt genuine. David Crockett was never more bearable than when he was teamed with Bob Caudle. It hit a lot of David Crockett's weaknesses as a commentator, which makes me wonder, was it a scheduling thing, or was he even up for the TBS job? Going with Shivani was interesting because he was a young guy, had really just gotten going a couple of years earlier, not even, in The Office and doing some interviews. They went with him and David Crockett, when for years David Crockett and Bob Caudle had been the combination. Would there have been a scheduling thing when the tapings were, or what do you think?
No. I mean, there might have been some consideration to that. I'm not saying there wasn't, but I think, to be quite honest, Jimmy Crockett Jr. and everybody had high hopes. They knew David was never going to be the lead guy, but David sort of, he got the spot because they couldn't hurt his feelings, right? But Tony was the young guy. He was the guy that was going to be because they moved away from Gordon Soley. Well, Tony Schiavone at that point in time may have been the best wrestling announcer he's ever been 40 years ago.
Yeah.
He's gone downhill ever since, but they wanted a younger guy, fresh face, TBS. And that's when a couple years later, JR kind of moved in. It had been Tony's spot, but at the same time, JR was still young then, had no health issues, and could outperform everybody. And that's why Tony ended up leaving and going to work for Vince for that year, because JR was kind of iggying him out just because TBS wanted him. He was better. He was a more sports announcer.
He was incredible. I mean, Jim Ross was great in the UWF and Mid-South, but he turned it up a notch. 88, 89, 90. I mean, just Everything through 92, he was incredible.
And
Incredible.
Tony and David were helped in the 86 to 87 period by the fact that it was the biggest stars in the company and the business and it was so hot and they just kind of had to not, and sometimes they did trip over their own dicks live on the air, but it wasn't that hard. But then as pay-per-view became a thing and more serious announcing of longer matches, the specials, the clashes, Tony nor David was going to be stellar at that. So, but back to Bob, because you asked about that. To be honest, at first, when Crockett got the time slot, I don't know that Bob Caudle at that point, because that was, he would have been in his mid 50s at that point and still working, I believe, in Raleigh for the Senator. I don't know if he'd have wanted to fly every morning to Atlanta to do a 2 or 3 hour television taping in addition to the stuff he was already doing. Now, I don't even know, never really asked whether or not that the Crockett increased schedule when they got more national may have contributed to him retiring from the other stuff, but I think they wanted somebody young and new anyway. So I don't think Bob campaigned for it or it was in any way offended if they didn't want him for it.
Well, he was also one of the last, I guess, part-time announcers they would have had, because everyone there, Shivani, Lance Russell, Jim Ross, everyone was a full-time, this is what you do. The Jesse Helms job was his full-time job. This was the side job.
Well, that's what I'm saying is I think by the time that Crockett expanded his schedule, even before TBS bought the company, I think that Bob may have retired or slowed down from that because he was still doing more traveling than he was ever used to in the old days for Crockett before TBS even bought it. But at the same time, again, we're thinking about this guy's age in when they bought the company, because he lived so long, and bless him that he did that. But so TBS bought the company in late 1988, which was 37 years ago. Bob was already almost 60. So it wasn't like he was going to goddamn change his whole life around. And as I said, Lance had that run, what was it, 2 years in WCW. Never had expected he would do it, never had particularly wanted it, but because he was such a announcing name when they first took over and wanted this dream announcing staff, they offered him more money than he ever thought he'd get, and he couldn't turn it down because Memphis was falling apart. So these were both guys late in their lives that were not looking for long-term career changes or employer changes or whatever and big runs.
But when you think about any of the Mid-Atlantic studio stuff that's out there, or most of it, or especially any of the mid-late 80s hot syndicated crowds for Crockett, the voice you think of is Bob Caudle yelling, not even yelling, but he had a good voice to, when things got loud, he got louder.
Raise it above the crowd with a sense of importance.
Yeah. But so many of those things, the Ronnie Garvin angle we talk about, that was on syndicated TV. That wasn't on the studio. So many of the hot moments, Nikita turning, it was the syndicated stuff with Bob Caudle.
Yeah. Well, fans, and that's another thing is that, they could be fans. He
said it though.
To them.
Now that you say that, it makes me. He always said fans will be right back. He always addressed the fans as fans.
Yes, imagine that. It was just smooth and folksy and easy to digest, and he treated things seriously because he was just the salesman there selling you the wild, wacky world. He didn't need to be wild and wacky, or elsewise what he was trying to sell you, you wouldn't believe him.
I do think about what Howard Baum said, that it always looked like his microphone was filled with helium and he was trying to hold it
Yeah.
down.
'Cause he held it sort of out away from his mouth and like he had a boil under his arm like I did that time when I had to hold my racket out at a 90-degree angle. But that was his again, that was back when those microphones were directional. You had to talk right into it back in the old days.
But again, a heck of a life and a great career as a wrestling commentator. His wife, I believe, just passed away this past June, I want to say.
Yes, they had been married 76 years. His wife's name was Jackie, and I last saw them at, probably what was it, 6 years ago, with the last time I was at WrestleCade, I believe it was, in Greensboro. Um, saw him and he had some health issues then, but they didn't get very far apart from each other. So I have a feeling, a lot of his enthusiasm went when she went earlier this year.
Again, a fantastic commentator, the voice of the Mid-Atlantic, the voice of Smoky Mountain, Bob Caudle.